This isn't a discipline story. And it isn't about some 5 a.m. morning routine thing. Daniel just started doing one small thing at his kitchen table before anyone else was up. And a year later, that one thing was paying his mortgage. He didn't wake up that early because he wanted to. He woke up that early because he had nowhere else to be. Daniel was 34 when his firm let him go. A Tuesday in June, shortly after the brutal tax season had ended. The kind of morning where the coffee machine takes forever, and everyone is a little too polite in the elevator. His manager, Karen, pulled him into a glass room that already had a box of tissues on the table. He remembers the box. He remembers how her mug shook when she set it down, like she was the one losing something. She said the partners had made some decisions. She said she was sorry. She was. That part wasn't fake. Daniel walked out holding a banker's box that still smelled of copy paper. He stood on the sidewalk and stared at a delivery truck for what he thinks was 10 minutes. It was probably 2. His phone buzzed. His wife, Helen. And he let it go. He didn't trust his own voice yet. He drove home the long way. He stopped at a drive-thru he never went to and ordered a coffee he didn't want. He sat in the parking lot and watched an old man in a Carhartt jacket help a woman carry her groceries to her car. Nothing profound. He just needed the world to keep moving around him so he could remember how to move with it. That night, he told Helen he had a headache and went to bed at 8. He kept his firing a secret for 3 days. It was pure cowardice, wrapped in the excuse of not wanting to ruin her week. Here's what nobody tells you about losing a job when you have a daughter and a mortgage and a wife who is 2 weekends away from finishing her yoga teacher training you can no longer pay for. There's no dramatic breakdown, no yelling at the dog. You just go quiet in a way you didn't know you could go quiet. Daniel kept ironing his shirts at night the way he'd done for 9 years. He still left the house at 7:20 in the morning. He kissed Maya on the head on the way out and told Helen he'd be late for dinner. And then he got in the car and sat in the driveway for a minute. Because he didn't actually know where he was going. He disappeared into his car in the afternoons and sat in a library parking lot reading old magazines until it was time to come home. On the third night, at 3:40 in the morning, Daniel lay in bed watching the ceiling fan turn. Helen was asleep. Maya, their 6-year-old, had crawled in between them and was drooling on his forearm. The fan clicked on every third rotation because one of the blades was loose. He'd been meaning to fix it for 2 years. He thought, quite calmly, if I lie here one more night, I'm going to lose my mind. So he got up. He walked downstairs in his socks. He made a cup of coffee, spilled a little on the counter, wiped it with the sleeve of his wife's bathrobe, because his own was in the wash. He sat down at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad. He didn't have a plan. He had a pen. He also had exactly $12.84 left in his daily checking account. The severance wouldn't clear for another 2 weeks. The credit cards were maxed out from Helen's yoga training. And he had checked the balance 3 times the night before, as if the number might change out of pity. At the top of the page, he wrote, "Things I actually know." Then he sat there for 20 minutes trying to think of one. Eventually, he wrote, "How small business owners quietly save on taxes." That was his job for 11 years. He'd spent a decade helping restaurant owners and dentists and one truly chaotic chiropractor stop overpaying. It wasn't sexy. It wasn't life-changing. It was the thing he knew, the way some people know the backs of their own children's heads. Under that, he wrote, "What I wish someone had told my dad." His father had run a small electrical contracting business in Akron until a tax mistake and 2 bad years closed it for good. Daniel was 12 when the shop shut. He still remembered his dad sitting on the back steps with a tin of chewing tobacco. Not crying, just breathing slow, like breathing was the hardest thing he'd done all week. Daniel drew a line under those 2 sentences and wrote, "Newsletter, free, every Tuesday." Then he went back to bed. He didn't tell Helen. The following morning, his alarm went off at 4. He didn't remember setting it after returning to bed. He got up anyway. He put on coffee, pulled the laptop across the table, wrote maybe 600 words about a deduction that most small business owners miss in their first year, and he wrote it the way he'd explain it to his Uncle Roy at a barbecue. Plain words, 1 joke, no jargon. He signed it Daniel, not Daniel CPA, just Daniel. He signed up for a free email tool and manually added his first 14 subscribers. 13 of them were family and close friends who always asked him for quick advice. The 14th was a neighbor named Linda, who he had helped with a messy tax return the year before. He closed the laptop at 5:50, went back upstairs, and got ready for a job that no longer existed. That morning, he finally told Helen. Helen cried. Daniel cried with her. The kind of crying where your shoulders shake and you're trying not to make noise. Maya wandered in, looked at her parents, asked why everyone was hugging, and then asked if she could have waffles. Helen, in a way that would later become one of Daniel's favorite memories of her, walked to the freezer, pulled out the waffles, and said, "Okay, so we figure it out." They figured it out the only way you can figure it out. Slowly. With arguments about grocery bills, with a severance that stretched further than they expected, with Helen finishing her training on a cheaper weekend intensive and picking up private yoga clients in the afternoons, with Daniel taking a temp bookkeeping job at a plumbing supply company 3 weeks later. Because a mortgage is not a metaphor. But he didn't stop the 4 a.m. habit. Every morning at 4, the alarm went off. He made coffee. He wrote. Tuesdays, he sent the newsletter. Thursdays, a shorter one with a single tip. On Sundays, he answered every reader email personally, even the rude ones, even the ones that just said thanks. Month 2 was ugly. Helen, exhausted, asked him one night over dishes why he was still doing this email thing when it wasn't paying anything. She wasn't cruel about it. She was scared. Scared looks like cruelty sometimes, especially at 9 in the evening when you're rinsing the same pot twice because your hands need something to do. Daniel told her the truth. He said he didn't know yet if it would work. He said he needed something that was his, something the glass conference rooms of the world couldn't take away on a grey Tuesday. He said if she gave him 6 months, he'd either have something to show, or he'd shut it down and never mention it again. She said 4. He thought about it, nodded, and said, okay. Month 3. A reader named Gretchen forwarded the newsletter to her bookkeeping forum. 200 people subscribed in a weekend. Daniel kept hitting refresh on his dashboard like a kid watching a bird feeder. Month 4. A man in Oregon paid Daniel $49 for a private hour-long call about his food truck's quarterly taxes. Daniel stared at the payment notification for a full minute before he showed Helen. She looked at the screen. She looked at him. She said, "That's not nothing bad." He wrote about that call, anonymized, in the next newsletter. It became the most forwarded essay he'd ever written, because he didn't write it like an accountant. He wrote it like a son. He wrote about his father and the shop and the tin of chewing tobacco on the back steps, and about how most small business owners he met weren't bad with money. They were just tired. He wrote that tired people make tired decisions, and that wasn't a moral failing. It was a math problem with nobody around to help them solve it. 17,000 people read that essay in 2 weeks. He got his first sponsorship offer from a bookkeeping software company. $600 for a mention at the bottom of one email. He almost said no because it felt like cheating. Helen, halfway through folding laundry, looked at him over a pile of Maya's socks and said, "Daniel, take the $600. He took the $600. By month 6, the newsletter brought in more than the temp job. By month 8, on its quieter weeks, it brought in more than he'd made at the firm. Month 10, he got an email from a woman named Patricia in Vermont. She ran a small family dairy with her husband. She said his newsletter had saved her just over $11,000 since the day she'd subscribed, and that her husband had read the essay about Daniel's dad out loud to her in the truck, and they had both had to pull over because they couldn't see the road. Daniel read that email 3 times. Then he walked into the kitchen where Helen was drinking coffee in the window light, and he said very quietly, "I think I can quit the plumbing job." She set her cup down. She said, "It's about time." He gave 2 weeks' notice the next morning. His boss at the plumbing supply company, a man named Vern who chewed toothpicks and had been quietly reading Daniel's newsletter for months without saying so, shook his hand and said, "I was wondering when you'd figure it out." That was 4 years ago. Daniel's newsletter now has about 41,000 readers. He makes more than he ever did at the firm, and he works fewer hours, though the hours he works are messier and more his. He still wakes up at 3:50 most mornings, not because he has to anymore, but because some part of him got rewired in those first dark months, and he can't quite shake it. He says the quiet before dawn is the only time the world isn't asking him to be someone. He doesn't tell his story the way you might expect. He doesn't call himself an entrepreneur. He calls himself a guy who wrote some emails. When people ask him for the secret, he gets a little uncomfortable and usually tries to change the subject. But if you press him, over a beer, on a porch, after his second drink, he'll eventually say something like this: "I don't think I built a business. I just kept showing up to a kitchen table at 4 in the morning when nothing else in my life made sense. It didn't matter to the table that I was out of work, or that Helen was scared out of her mind, or whether what I was writing was any good. It was a piece of furniture. It waited." That's the part that gets me every time. Most of us are waiting for a plan we can feel confident about, or for the right moment, or at the very least, a weekend where nothing else is on fire. Daniel didn't have any of that. He had $12.84 in his checking account, a daughter who wanted waffles, a wife who was trying very hard not to cry in front of him, and a ceiling fan that clicked on every 3rd rotation. What he had instead of a plan was a table and a chair, and a promise to himself that he'd sit in that chair for a little while every morning before the world started pulling at him. If you've been waiting for a big moment to change your life, I want to offer you something smaller. Find a chair somewhere quiet. Set an alarm a bit earlier than you'd like, and sit with the one thing your life has already taught you. Not the thing you wish you were better at, but the thing you already know in your hands. You don't have to send a newsletter. You don't have to build anything. Just show up to the table, pulled up a chair, and got to work.